Open world and sandbox. We've heard these terms a lot over the last decade or so, and while they actually do mean different things, they're often used interchangeably, especially in promotional materials. I think we've all seen a press release that confuses these two terms, perhaps on accident, perhaps on purpose, who knows. But what's the actual distinction? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx we ask the question, sandbox versus open world, what's the difference? Now let's just make a distinction as to some popular games that use either term. The game that's probably the most associated with the term open world is obviously Grand Theft Auto. On the other hand, one of the most popular games over the last long period of time that is also commonly called a sandbox game is Minecraft. Now, these are two very, very different franchises, and I think that they help draw the distinction between the two types of games without actually even saying anything at all. Now, what's so similar about these types of games that makes them so easy to confuse? Well, for one, they both take place in very large worlds. Exploration is certainly an element of what you're expected to do in those worlds, and a lot of what they exist for is specifically immersing yourself in somewhere else. But even in that element, we can start to find the differences. For instance, in Grand Theft Auto, the emphasis isn't so much on controlling the world so much as existing inside the world. One of the things that can be used to make sure that a player feels as though the point is to occupy a world is to create a narrative within the world that they take part in. This isn't to say that a sandbox game can't have a narrative and that an open world game is made of only narrative-oriented games, but I do think it helps illustrate the difference. It makes more sense to expect a narrative in an open world game than in a pure sandbox game. An open world simply is an open world, whereas a sandbox gives you more elements of control. And while yes, you can kind of go crazy within Grand Theft Auto and there are sandbox elements, there's not a lot you can fundamentally do to change the world itself. This is just not the case in Minecraft, where the point of the game is to manipulate the world. Now, this creates standards that could imply a pretty strict binary between sandbox and open world, but I'm not so sure that's the right way to go. Can you do as much in the way of changing the environment in, say, Saints Row as you might be able to in Minecraft? Not really. And also, Saints Row has a narrative, but I would almost say that I think Saints Row leans more towards sandbox than a simple open world. And that's not to say that Grand Theft Auto doesn't have sandbox elements to it. It is in a lot of ways a platform for you to do things, as much as it is an immersive world for you to occupy. But what's the main point? I think the main point is kind of where we derive whether or not it's sandbox from, because like I said, these games can contain sandbox elements and not be full-blown sandbox games. Or in some cases, they might seem as though they're more of an open world game, and to the naked eye perhaps lean on the ideas of narrative and occupation of a world or role within one. If somebody didn't know what Just Cause was, for instance, one might assume that it is a linear action game if all they saw was the trailers. And it certainly does contain those elements, but the point of the game is to give you a platform to do absolutely absurd action movie stuff in a sandbox fashion. And while sandbox games often take the appearance of an open world game, in which you play a character and can explore and can do all of the things that you would do in an open world game, it's important to recognize that sandbox also includes games that are nothing like that. For instance, all of the old Maxis games, the Sim Cities, the Sim Farms, the Sim Ant thing, those are sandbox games, and there's almost no chance at all you could mistake that for an open world game. Still, it gives you a world that you are allowed to manipulate at your own will to play in as if it is your sandbox. While there might be objectives, you can also make your own objectives. A sandbox game is more or less a world and a set of tools to manipulate the world. An open world game is a world given to you to occupy. These distinctions make more sense theoretically though, like I said, on account games are more likely to exist on a spectrum between one and the other. And interestingly enough, an open world game can easily become a sandbox game if one accounts for the fact that there is a modding community involved. Skyrim is an open world game. You can do everything that you might want to occupy the world of Skyrim. But if you add in mods, Skyrim becomes a sandbox, a platform, something for you to manipulate and change. In fact, almost any game can become a sandbox game in this respect. People do definitely come up with things that developers never would have thought of. Developers often try to make sandbox games as open-ended as possible, too. Whereas with an open world game, there's more clear-cut objectives, and the game itself may even take a fairly linear track through what many consider to be a more non-linear approach at a video game. One way or another, a journey is a journey, whether or not the levels are structured in order to funnel you through the journey, or if you just have waypoints on a map that do the same thing. So I think the ultimate takeaway isn't so much that there are open world games and there are sandbox games, because like I said, depending on what you want to do in a game, you can probably make one into the other, either through modding or role-playing, depending on what you're looking at. You could get a couple of friends together and role-play in Minecraft if you really wanted to. It's more that there are open-world elements and there are sandbox elements. I think it's fairly easy to understand the difference between the two, but it's important to understand that the possibilities of a game are pretty much endless, depending on how resourceful you are. What do you think? What are the defining features to you of the difference between sandbox and open world? What are some of your favorite games that are more of one than the other, or perhaps a good example of both in one game? Leave us a comment, let us know what you're thinking, and if you like this video, please click like. If you want to see our brand new videos, which we upload every day, click the subscribe button, as well as do not forget to click the notification bell. And we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.